by way of introduction, we're going to be going over some chapters in Joshua. So chapters 4 through basically 7 today. And of course you have to wonder, what does this have to do with the last day of unleavened bread? Of course, typically when we talk about the season, we talk about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. All right? So the Israelites came out of sin. So you had the Passover, you had the death angel that went over and killed all the firstborn. And so you had this passing over, this sacrificing of the firstborn in that respect. And then you had the coming out of Egypt, a type of sin, putting sin out of the lives. It was unleavened bread. And then for the next 7 days, we had the Israelites marching out of the land of Egypt, out of sin. And finally, on the last day of unleavened bread, they crossed the Red Sea, and it was a type of baptism. But where did they go? What did they go into? And that's going to be the focus of today's message. Now, it's not going to be the focus that they went out of that and they were now effectively out of Egypt, out of the boundaries and the limits of Egypt and its reach and its power. Of course, the army had been destroyed as they went through the Red Sea behind the Israelites. But they come out of this land of sin, figuratively, and they went into, and they were heading towards what? Well, the problem was that they got off the track very quickly, and because of that, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So as they wandered for this amount of time, that first generation, the adults of the Israelites anyway, they died off. And even Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land because of a mistake that he had made. It was the second generation that were the ones that were to enter the promised land. And we can pick up the story in Joshua 4. Joshua 4 verses 23 and 24. It says, "For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord that is mightily, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." So what we're going to see here is that this is happening at the same time of the year, during these days of unleavened bread and Passover. So what happened, though, is that what we're going to see is that all this time preceded the days of unleavened bread, and then the unleavened bread was more or less the end of that story, kind of, as it were, with the Israelites. So the Israelites and their coming out during those days was significant to especially the first part. But what we're going to see here with Joshua and them going into the land of Canaan and crossing the river Jordan are these similarities, but it's more or less, it starts there and continues on further. And that's, again, synonymous to what we are talking about today. So now, at this time, it was only the ones that were 20 and up. They were not responsible adults yet. They had, God had committed judgment upon all the other older Israelites because they were unwilling to stick with the plan. But in Numbers 14, 29, 30, if you just want to put that in your notes, it says, "The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness, all of you who were numbered according to the entire number from 20 years old and above, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. And you shall by no means enter the land which I swore that I would make you dwell in." So they were not going to be. So again, we have this mindset of these new people who had not been through, this next generation had not been through what the older generation had gone through as adults. Now, just back up to verse 19 of Joshua 4, we get a context of when this happened. "Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho." So now, the interesting thing is, okay, that's a day of significance. I mean, do we know what happened on that day? Let's turn back to Exodus 12. Of course, you want to keep your finger in Joshua. But Exodus 12, verses 2 through 6. What we're going to see too is how God has been working out this plan all the way along, and how it's significant and how it occurs on specific days and dates and times, because it all fits in. And this is where we're trying to understand and get the meaning out of this Old Testament story. Again, everybody knows the story, but do you know the details behind it, or the things that led up to it, and why they happened? And of course, why is that pertinent to us today, specifically on this last day of unleavened bread? So Exodus 12 and verse 2 said, "This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month," to the first month, "every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons, according to each man's need. You shall make your count for the lamb." So on the 10th day of the first month, it was a selection process of the lamb that would be used on the Passover on the 14th. It says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep this one, until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." So what we're seeing here is that there was a selection process that happened on the 10th day of the first month. Now, you might find it interesting that Christ, when he came into the city, when he came into Jerusalem, his triumphant entry on the donkey to fulfill prophecy, right? That it was, according to many, at that same time, the exact same time, when Christ was chosen, okay, at that time, that day, on that 10th day, to be the sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice. Of course, he was chosen since before the world began, when the plan was put into motion, before there was anything. But here we are coming down to his last Passover, and there's the selection process, this selecting of a lamb for that Passover. Okay, so he came in on that day, on the 10th. He was selected on that day, and he was acknowledged as to who he was at that time, that he was the king, and they treated him that way with the laying down of the coats and the palm fronds and whatnot that they had used at that time, and they recognized him as this king. But of course, what happened on the 14th? Well, he became the Passover sacrifice. So now what we're seeing here is that these children, now I say children, some of them are probably getting close to 60, they are crossing over Jordan, right? At this time, on the 10th day of the first month. They are being chosen, they're being selected by God at this time. Now, let's notice, skipping on to chapter 5, that he was choosing them for this covenant relationship with him. Joshua 5 and verse 1, and we'll read through verse 8. And we see what happens next in the story. So we're going through the story, and we're going to see what kind of meaning we can get out of it and what it means for us today. "So it was when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, that their heart melted. There was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel." So everybody looked at them and said, okay, this is, again, when they're saying it, this is Jehovah. This is the Tetragrammaton. This is the Lord, the all caps. They say, okay, they call him by name. They know who he is because of the renown of the things that their God had done for them. And the people are going, oh no, they're coming for us. What can we do? There's nothing that we can do, because who can contend with somebody that's that mighty, who can stop the river Jordan so that they can cross over on dry land, just as God had done it for them with the Red Sea. So At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And, okay, so just let me stop for a second. So what we're seeing here, though, is that they were not circumcised. God had already made a covenant with them when they had come out of Egypt, way back when, 40 years before. And he said, okay, if you're going to do this, if you're going to do the Passover with me, you have to be circumcised. Okay, so everybody who's going to partake of the Passover has to be circumcised. And we'll go over that in just a little bit. But here we have now 40 years later, for some reason, all of these males who weren't adults at the time had not been circumcised. And to me, it goes to the rebellious nature that they had while they were, after they had come out of Egypt, as well as they continue to have through this whole time in the wilderness. So even if they were keeping Passover, these people were not doing it as circumcised. And you have to ask yourself, why is this thrown in here? Why? It's like, okay, we're talking about Passover, now we're talking about circumcision. Why does the Bible talk about that all the time? Well, verse 4, he goes, "And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised." Okay, so to me it does still indicate a wrong attitude and perspective of the people who are wandering in the wilderness. So it's no wonder why they had to wander for 40 years. So continuing verse 6, "For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed." They died in the wilderness and it ate them up, so to speak, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers, that he would give us a land flowing with milk and honey. So because they did not do what they were supposed to do, because they did not fully come out of sin, they were not allowed to go to where they were promised that they could go. "Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised, because they hadn't been circumcised on the way. So it was, when they had finished circumcising all the people, that they stayed in their places in the camp until they were healed." Of course, that's why I have to smile about. Of course they did. It's so much different, as a child, as opposed to an adult. The stories are, I've seen boys who are circumcised, and the worst part of the circumcision is, when the cold air hits them. It's not even necessarily the circumcision, but also there are stories in the Bible where, who was it? Was it Reuben? Was it Simeon and Levi, who went and they said, "Well, if you want to marry our sister Dinah, then you all need to be circumcised." And they all got circumcised, and then Simeon and Levi went in and they killed all of them. Just the two of them went in and killed all of them because they had just been circumcised, and they were still healing. So yes, that's why I have to kind of smile. That wasn't in my notes, but it was like, okay, yeah, I understand that. But let's go back to Exodus 12 and verse 43 and 49. We try to understand this circumcision and why God's inserting it at this time of the year and at this point in their progress in the days. Exodus 12, verse 43 through 49. "And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover." All right, so again, we're seeing an equation here, an equating of Passover and circumcision, and how these two are happening at the same time. Twice now. Okay, so here it is, and we'll read it as we get through, and we'll see that, but also at the time of Joshua. He says, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it." So if you get a servant, your servant can eat it if they get circumcised. So a servant can do this. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. Right? So they're the uncircumcised. In one house it shall be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you, so now we're a stranger with you, and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it. So a stranger can keep it. A servant can keep it. An Israelite can keep it. A stranger can keep it if they are circumcised. So let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. So if you are circumcised, then you can be the law is, okay, you can be a part of the Passover. If you're not, then you can't partake of the Passover. Now let's turn over to Deuteronomy 30 and verses 1 through 6. Now we're starting to see, okay, well, why circumcision? What is this about? Okay, what is it that God really wants? And I think you all know where we're heading, but let's see that even in the Old Testament times, God tried to convey this to them. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 1. Now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, you call them to mind, among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. And you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you to do today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity, have compassion on you, gather you again from all the nations where the Lord God has scattered you. Now, if any of you are driven out to the farthest points under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you. From there he will bring you. Then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you, multiply you more than your fathers. So he's saying, again, there's blessings and cursings here for doing and obeying his voice and doing what he says, what he commands. Then he says, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. Okay, so obviously this is not talking physically. You cannot circumcise the heart. The heart does not need to be circumcised physically. So he's making an equation here. He's equating the circumcision of the males with the circumcision of the heart. And he says, I call in verse 19, I call heaven and earth to witness, as a witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. So he's saying, again, in circumcision, there is a literal cutting away of the flesh that covers. Okay, when you do the circumcision of the heart, this is what God's asking, and he's saying, look, keep my laws, circumcise your heart, remove that veil, that covering over it, get rid of the flesh. Okay, again, this is what we're called to do, is get rid of the flesh, and choose life and death. Choose life over death, blessing over cursing, and you will live if you obey. But to do that, you need to be circumcised of the heart. And so circumcision becomes synonymous to being converted to God's way of life. Let's turn over to Colossians 2, verses 11 through 13. Colossians 2, verses 11 through 13. Well, again, keep in mind, we're talking about what they were doing in Joshua's time, okay, and what it was a symbol for. God gave all this symbol, all these meanings. This is why we don't mess with exactly what it is that God says to do. We can't take it upon ourselves to do something different, because he's the one that's orchestrating these things. And he orchestrated. This is not an accident that they came into and cross the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and that it's right here before Passover and unleavened bread. So Colossians 2, verses 11 through 13, it says, in him, speaking of Christ, you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ. So you're putting off the flesh. And again, it's a figurative putting away of the flesh, the carnality, who and what you are, what you were before Christ was in you. And then because Christ, and because of this circumcision that he has performed on us, this one that's made without hands, we are able to do that. And okay, let me just back it up and just say that again. Putting off the body of the sins of flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism. The thought continues. In which you were raised with him through faith in working of God who raised him from the dead. So now we're seeing, again, we're equating this circumcision with conversion. And you see that this circumcision, this revealing of the heart, this taking back of the flesh, so that God's ways, God's laws, his commands can be written into our heart, happens at this time of baptism. It says this is all happening when we were buried with him in baptism. This killing of the old man, the shedding of the flesh, and being raised up by faith in the Spirit and the newness of life, okay, which Romans talks about. So, but he says something similar because it's the same guy, who through faith and working of God who raised him from the dead, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he was made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. So, okay, we're circumcised in Christ, and by this, again, this whole process, there's a whole lot of different things going on here, our sins are forgiven as well. So Christ removes this veil, the one that's over our heart, at baptism. And so in the same way, we can see that only circumcised people were allowed to take the Passover. We see that only spiritually circumcised are allowed to take the Passover in the New Testament times. So this baptism is a prerequisite for Passover, just as it was in the past. Only now, by being spiritually circumcised, we're able to partake of the New Testament Passover. So hopefully we're all following all that along. Romans 2, verses 28 and 29, again, further clarifies it. And again, we're going to put this all together back with what we were talking about in Exodus 12, in terms of who gets to be a part of this congregation of Israel, who gets to take the Passover with them. Romans 2, verses 28 and 29. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly. Okay, so if you're just a Jew by blood, if you just look like a Jew, he says that's not the one that we're talking about here. That's not the kind of Jew that you're to become. He says, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men but from God. So he's saying this physical circumcision, and again they had the big conference in Acts 15 about it. He said that is not what we're talking about. That is not the one. This is not the necessary one. To become a spiritual Jew, you have to circumcise the heart. This is the way that you become part of the Israel of God, is Galatians, if you want to put 6:15 and 16 in your notes. Again, it talks about circumcision there. In fact, let's go ahead and we can just turn there real quick. Galatians 6, verses 15 and 16. We become a Jew, or this spiritual Israelite, at the time of our spiritual circumcision. Okay? When God removes that veil at the time of baptism, and you get to become a part of the congregation. You're no longer a stranger or a foreigner that couldn't be a part of the Passover, couldn't be a part of God. But Galatians 6, verses 15 and 16, it says, "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but a new creation. And as many as walk according to this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God." So to be a part of the Israel of God, to be a part of spiritual Israel, you have to have this circumcision of the heart. Right? Just as it was back in those days, in ancient Israel times, that to be a part of the congregation and partake of the Passover at that point in time, you had to be circumcised, or at least you were supposed to be circumcised. Right? And so now we see this equating of the two and why it was necessary for them to become circumcised once again. It's because of what it portended for the future and what it means for us now. If you want, just put Ephesians 2:11 through 13. I'm not going to read that at this point in time. In your notes, again, it just, Paul, yet in another book, talks a little bit more about it, and it can add a little bit to you if you'd like. But back to Joshua 5 and verse 9. He says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore, the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day." So we're talking about he finished circumcising all the people, and then he calls it Gilgal, which, again, whenever you read this, it kind of, I mean, to me, it struck me as kind of funny. "For this day I have rolled away the reproach." I'm going, what? I got to look into this more. What does that mean, rolled away? It's like, you know, when they say something to me that seems like out of the ordinary, you're going to go, what does that mean? Well, interestingly enough, is that the word rolled away is a play on the word Gilgal. The word Gilgal means basically the same thing, rolled or wheel. They kind of have the same root. And so he's kind of making making them kind of synonymous, a little play on words. So what happened was, previously the slaves were, the Israelites were slaves to sin in Egypt. And the time that they had spent there was ignominious and disgraceful. And he's saying that's going to end this day. Okay? So after the circumcision, after this commitment, as it were, to going and being a part of this covenant with God, he says, okay, it's done. Okay? That reproach, those times, we're going to put that behind us. We're going to roll it away like Gilgal. And again, they made this pile of foreskins right there in Gilgal where they was going to leave it to this day. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that Gilgal is a play on words right here, but also the common root word for this word, Galal, the Hebrew word for skull comes from it. Okay? So the word for skull is Golgoloth, okay? Which, again, comes from this root Galal, because the skull is kind of round like a wheel. Now, there is a place that's named after a skull in the Bible. In Aramaic, it's called Golgotha, and in the Greek it's called Golgotha, okay? Because of where it was the roundness of the rock there. Now, when you take this Hebrew word for wheel, and you add the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet to it, the Aleph and the Tav to it, it makes the name of the place where Christ was crucified. Matthew 27, verses 32 through 35. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. So we get what's going on here. And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave him wine, sour wine, mingled with gall to drink. And I think gall was kind of an anesthetic of sorts. But when he tasted it, he would not drink. He wasn't going to take this and lessen what it was that he was supposed to be doing. Then they crucified him at that time. So effectively, what we have here at this place called Golgotha, right? So we went from the rolling away, the Gilgal, Golgotha. So effectively what we have is by adding the Alpha and Omega to the word in Joshua, our reproach is taken away here at the same place. So our reproach, our inability to come before God, our inability to come out of sin was removed. This reproach that we have was taken away at a place called Golgotha, which again all harkens back to what's happening here in Joshua. And of course the interesting thing is that Christ is called the Alpha and the Omega. And so you take this Alpha and Omega and you add it to what happened there in Joshua, and we have the place where our reproach was taken away. And so we see the similarity in terms of what was happening in that time, and again what was to happen in the future, and what we now can benefit from because of that. So back to Joshua 5 and verse 10. It says, "Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal." So I'm not sure that we'll be able to look at the word Gilgal again without thinking something differently. But that was the point, right? He put, again, this mound of foreskins there at Gilgal, and so that everybody would remember. So now the children, verse 10, of Joshua 5, of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. So again, we see this proceeding of the circumcision, this circumcision that now, at that time, happened right before Passover so that they could partake of Passover. Then, it says in verse 11, they ate the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on that very same day. So they had the Passover, and then the next day they had the first day of unleavened bread, where they ate unleavened bread. And then, verse 12, the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land. Okay, so that was the first day of unleavened bread. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. So God had been providing for them in a supernatural way while they were in the wilderness, but that all ended on the first day of unleavened bread. Now that they had reached their destination and their time of wandering was over, God no longer had to do this for them. So now chapter 6 and verse 1. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. Again, we go back to chapter 5 and verse 1 and talk about how all their hearts were melting. So it's no surprise that it was securely shut up. None went out, none came in. And this Jericho was a very well fortified city. I want to say it had double walls around it. So if you were able to breach the first wall, you only put yourself into an even more dire situation by being between the two walls. But nonetheless, Jericho is synonymous with the world. They're synonymous with people who are relying on their own might. They're people who go and do whatever they want to do. This was a peoples that were full of sin in this land. And God did not want his people who had come out of sin to go back into that in Jericho. So verse 2, the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I've given Jericho into your hand, its king, and the mighty men of valor." Again, this is before anything has happened, but God's saying it, and so it's going to be done. "You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. Then you shall do this 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times. Then the priest shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat." And again, fall down in a kind of a funny way, because walls don't fall down flat. If they fall down, like say in a great earthquake, they would just fall straight down typically. but all the walls fell flat, and even the double walls. So again, there's a bit of godly intervention that's going to happen. And the people shall go up, every man straight before him. Now, as I was looking at this, to me, it just, and this will be something we'll have to go over in greater depth in the future, but there's this, to me, this parallel to what's going to happen in the future in Revelation. Because here we have the 7 trumpets, right? Again, so you have seals, trumpets, plagues, right? So you have 7 seals. The 7th seal is 7 trumpets. And then the 7th trumpet is 7 plagues. And so what we see here is that they go around once for the first 6 times, and then on the 7th, they go around 7 times. So you have that 7 within the 7, right? And also, if you look at, again, you put Revelation 8:2 and 11:15 in your notes. I just want to mention this kind of in passing, and maybe I'll be able to go over it later. But it said in 8:2, it says, the 7 angels who stood before him were given 7 trumpets. Again, you have 7 priests with 7 trumpets here. And then at the very end, the 7th angel sounded, and then the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord. And it was there were loud voices in heaven. So it's interesting that the people shouted, and then this kingdom of Jericho became, Joshua's, as it were. And Joshua, the name for Joshua is basically the same name as Jesus. And Joshua was a type of Jesus anyway. But again, it was God that was leading them, so it became his, and he was the one behind it and whatnot. But I just thought it was interesting. But again, I'll have to go back and look at that and figure that out a little bit more, because whenever we talk about this, we're talking about unleavened bread. When we're talking about the trumpets, we're talking about the Feast of Trumpets, typically, when we're talking about the trumpets. But there may be something in there, maybe some overlap, or maybe some foreshadowing, or maybe some things are going to happen at this time that are go until that time, or until trumpets, then it comes back around to unleavened bread or whatever. But I just thought it was interesting, and I couldn't let it go as we passed over it, because I'm going, okay, I haven't heard anybody really talk about that before, so now I'm going to have to go look at that and read it and study it and see what we can come up with. Anyway, down to verse 17 of Joshua 6. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are in or with her in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. Again, this even ties into the future as well, is that when God goes in and destroys the whole city, okay, when he goes in and destroys the world, basically, with the seals and the trumpets and the plagues, that there will be a remnant that survives. Again, it's going to be the remnant that are, when we start talking about Israel and Judah, that's going to be the ones that were doing what was right, or came to their senses, who repented, who saw that they needed to be different than the world that around them, which is more or less what Rahab did. And not only that, Rahab was a sinner, everybody in the world's a sinner, and there were people that were with her that were saved because of her and her actions. Now, moving on to verse 18, I was just tying in verse 17 with what was above, what we just talked about. But verse 18, it says, now, and you, by all means, this is whenever the city falls and it comes down and you're going to go into it. When you go into it, it says, by all means abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. So again, picture this. Here it is. This happened, right, for 7 days. So they started out on the first day of unleavened bread, and they did this for 7 days till the last day of unleavened bread. Then they circled 7 times on the last day of unleavened bread, and they shouted, and the city walls fell. And he says, whenever that happens, whenever you go in, he says, that's not what you're going into. That is sin. Okay? That is not to be partaken of. I know it's here, and it's in this area and in this land, but you are supposed to come out of Egypt and not go back into those things. He says they are accursed. Put 2 Corinthians 6, verse 17 and 18 in your notes. We just went over that one recently, but it basically says, come out from among them and be separate. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I'll be a father to you, and you be my sons and daughters. So again, he's talking about, it says, don't go and partake of those things. Be separate. Don't be a part of the world and touch what is in the world. Okay, I want you, now that you have crossed over the Jordan, now that you are circumcised, now that you have taken Passover, now that you have gone through the days of unleavened bread and removed sin from your life, you remove this symbolic leavening, which is a symbol of sin, out of your life, don't go after this, okay, on this last day, don't go and dirty yourself anymore. Right? He says, don't head that direction like your forefathers did when they came out of Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea on the last day, and then they messed up. He says, I want you heading in this direction, okay, because this is Canaan. This is the promised land. This is the area which was synonymous with the kingdom of God. This was going to be the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that God was going to give them, right? And he did. And it was a type of the kingdom of God to come. This is not what God wants in the kingdom. They're accursed things. So don't be a part of it. So the items that were in there were not sacred. They were not holy. And he says, you know, come out from them and be separate. Revelation 18, 4 through 5. Revelation 18, verses 4 through 5. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to the heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So again, God looks at this. And again, modern Babylon is a system more than a place per se. It is a way that Satan had started from the very beginning, and he continued to propagate throughout the history of man, this system, this Babylonian system that is his. And you know, Canaan, the land of Canaan, Sodom and Gomorrah, all these places were just another replication of that way of life. He says, don't be a part of that. I don't want you to be a part of that. Again, that's for us. He said, be holy. He says, I set you apart on the first month and 10th day. You're circumcised. Don't profane the holy. You are now holy. Don't be profaned by what's in there. You're de-leavened now. You don't sin. And he said, these things that the world has to offer are not for you. They're not good for you. These are not the things I want you to have and be a part of. 2 Peter 2. It'd be good to go through and read the whole chapter, but let's say we just skip for the sake of time, skip down through it. Again, he's just talking about, you know, people who secretly bring in destructive heresies. They deny the Lord. They have destructive ways. Their covetousness, deceptive words, and whatnot. He said, you know, he says all this stuff's going to happen, and it's going to be there. He says, God did not spare, in verse 4, the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. He didn't spare the ancient world. He saved Noah and 8 people, right? But he didn't spare people because of their sins. Even, verse 6, turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes and condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. Now it's very interesting because Sodom and Gomorrah was not that far from Jericho. It was just south of there. And it happened, when did Sodom and Gomorrah happen, right? It was the time of Abraham and Lot. So it was about 400 years before, 400, I guess maybe we're getting closer to 470 or so. But so 450 years it happened, and it still was a reminder of these things. And yet these people were not doing this. He delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day, seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. What was he doing when he lived among them? He had to be in the world. He wasn't going to be taken out of the world, but he was also not part of the world. Now, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation and reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who walk according to the flesh and the lust. So again, he continues to go on and talk about the way that these people are. And he says, basically, that's the way that we were. And in the very end, what does he say? He says, let's pick it up in verse 20. It says, for if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, right, so who are we talking about here? Well, we're not only talking about the Israelites who came out of Egypt, and now they're headed towards Jericho, and God said, don't touch the accursed thing. He's talking to us as well, that once we've come out of these things, you don't head back towards them. You don't head towards Egypt, right? And you aren't going to partake of Jericho the way it is. So, if they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, if you become converted, if you become baptized, have God's Holy Spirit, have this circumcision of the heart, they are again entangled in them. If you go back to the world, the latter end is worse for them than in the beginning. Because now it's the second death that you have to contend with as opposed to just a first death that they have to contend with. They're going to get their chance later. So even if they die, they're going to be resurrected and they're going to have the chance that we now have. But for you, you cannot go back there. You cannot go towards the accursed thing. He says, for it would have been better for them to have not known the way of righteousness than to have known it and turned from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it has happened to them, according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. So he's saying, again, the thought of a dog going back to its own vomit is repulsive and turns its stomach. And I don't know if you've ever seen that happen, but they do. They throw up and then they go back to it and they lick it up. They go back to it. God is saying that's the way it is for us. If we turn back, after having come out of sin, and you want to go back to Egypt, it's the same thing. It's when he equates the vomit, that's the way that it was, the world was. Our ways were whenever we were in the world. But he says, don't do that. So back to Joshua 6, verse 20. So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet that the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up to the city, every man straightway before him, and they took the city. So the walls came tumbling down in this unusual manner. One that made it flat, that they were able to easily cross. And it was not just, if there was two walls, it wasn't just the first one. It was all of them so that they could just go straightway in there without deterring or detouring in any way, shape, or form. Verse 21, they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. But Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the country, go into the harlot's house from there and bring out the woman, all that she has, as you swore to her. And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had, and they brought them out, all their relatives, and left them outside the camp of Israel. So again, it reiterates the point that Rahab was one of the few that was saved in that environment. God went through, and his judgment on the people for being such a sinful nation was that it was death, right? So they went through, and at God's command, all the people, man, woman, young and old, they all died, as well as all the animals that were with them. And then verse 24, they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and irons they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And again, God commanded them to do that. And Joshua spared the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel this day, because she hid the messengers from whom Joshua sent out to spy out Jericho. So now, what we have here is then that this cleansing that's going to happen. Again, I can't help but get away or keep coming back to what's going to happen in the future when God comes in and cleans house, that there's not going to be much left over. And he's going to start with a new slate, and he's going to say, okay, this is the way it is. Well, he said to Israel at this time, he says, this is what you go do, and we're going to burn it up. He says, I'm giving you this land. Okay? So I don't want you to mingle with the people in it. I don't want you to become a part of the world. It says, because what they have to offer is not what you need. It's not what I want you to have. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17, a well-known verse that we've gone over before, but it bears repeating. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. It says, do not love the world or the things in the world. Why? Because they're accursed. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So this is his admonition to us, even in New Testament times. It's the same. You don't go into that. So after you've gone through this, putting all the sin out of your lives, and you become baptized, and you become converted, you've had your heart circumcised, he says, don't go back to those things that you came out of. He said, we've conquered that. Okay? We have victory over that. He says, you don't want to go back to that, and you don't want to take any part of it. He says, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. Luke 17, continuing even this thought here about the world passing away. Luke 17, 26 through 30. And this is what we have to understand, that it's for a short time that we need to do this, that we need to continue towards the promised land, right? But not partake of anything that's wrong along the way. It says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. So what were they doing in the time of Noah? They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So they're going on about life as normal. Okay, of course, now normal was not the righteous way of life. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, and they built. Again, everything going on normally there, just like it is going on today. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, and what day was that? Again, I think a very good case can be made for it being the last day of unleavened bread, is whenever Sodom was destroyed. Whenever Lot, his daughters, and the wife temporarily went out of Sodom, okay, was probably the last day of unleavened bread. Now, what happened with the wife? She turned around. It wasn't just that she turned around, glanced, and wanted to see the big explosion or anything like that. She longed to be back in that way of life. We know what Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a time that still it resonates today among people, even in the world. They know what Sodom and Gomorrah was synonymous with. So here we have, that's what she wanted to go back to. Okay, what was there? You know, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Right? The accursed things. She wanted to go backwards, the wrong direction. Going back that way leads to death. This second death, this worse than before type situation especially for the Christian. Okay? Now, Lot and his daughters continued the other direction, away from those things after the days of unleavened bread. So but on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so, it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So in the future, you're saying it's going to be just like this. It's going to be everything's going to be going about, and everybody's going to live their lives, quote unquote, normally, right? Drinking, eating, buying, selling, building, planting. They're going to be doing all those things. And then sudden destruction comes upon them. Okay, to be differentiated between those, we cannot be a part of it. Okay, that is not the direction we can head. We cannot head back to Egypt. And so at this time when these things happen, the question is, what side of the wall of Jericho are you going to be on? Are you going to be the one in Jericho? Or are you going to be the one on this side? Are you going to be the one on the outside of the ark knocking on the door? Or are you going to be on the inside of the ark? Or are you going to be the one that comes to the wedding supper and knocks on the door and it's too late? So which side of the wall or the door are you going to be knocking on at the time of Christ's return? So again, we're to come out of sin, as these days depict, but we are to conquer it, and that we're not to go on in that same direction or to be a part of that environment or have anything to do with it. So let's not forget where we came out of, but let's remember where we're to be going.